I knew the second that cold water touched my skin that someone was about to try and take it away from me. The lake was quiet that morning. Just the low hum of cicadas and the soft ripple of water brushing against the dock my grandfather built with his own hands back in 1972. The wood still rough under my fingers as I pulled myself up, water dripping off my arms. The smell of wet cedar and lake algae hanging in the air like something permanent, something earned, and for a moment it felt like mine again. The way it always had been, until the sharp click of heels on would snap that silence clean in. Half. That'll be $1,000, she said, her voice cutting through the morning like a receipt being torn in half. And I turned to see Victoria Hensley standing at the edge of my dock, crisp white blouse, oversized sunglasses, holding a laminated notice like she was serving papers in a courtroom instead of trespassing on private land. I could still feel the chill of the water clinging to my skin as she stepped closer, her perfume drifting over the lake air. Something expensive trying to mask something uglier underneath, and she didn't even hesitate as she dropped the paper onto the wet boards beside me, letting it soak just enough to wrinkle at the edges. Unauthorized use of HOA managed water, she continued, like she'd rehearsed it, like she'd been waiting for this moment, and I just stared at her for a second, the words not landing because they didn't make sense. Not here, not on this water, not on land my family had owned for over 50 years. The paper stuck slightly to the dock when I picked it up, the ink already bleeding at the corners, but the number was still clear, bold, deliberate, $1,000. I actually laughed, just once, a short breath of disbelief that tasted like lake water and something bitter, because standing there, barefoot on wood that I knew every inch of, being told I was trespassing felt like being accused of stealing your own name. She didn't laugh. She just adjusted her sunglasses and looked past me, out at the water like she already owned it, like the lake had somehow signed itself over to her between last summer and now. This is HOA property now, Ethan, she said, calm, controlled, practiced, and that's when I noticed the sign behind her, freshly planted near the shoreline. White metal, red lettering. No private use. HOA regulated area. The post still surrounded by disturbed dirt, like it had been shoved into the ground overnight while nobody was watching. The air felt different all of a sudden, heavier, like a storm that hadn't decided if it wanted to break yet. And I could hear voices up the hill, neighbors gathering, watching, phones already out because nothing travels faster than HOA drama on a quiet morning. I looked back at the lake, at the slow, steady movement of water that didn't care about signs or fines or people like Victoria Hensley, and I realized something in that moment, standing there dripping onto a piece of paper that had no right to exist. She thought this was already over, like she'd already won, like I was just another name on a list she could manage, control, charge. What she didn't know was that I hadn't said a single word yet, and I wasn't going to, not today, not while she was still talking, because some fights aren't won in the moment they start, they're won in the silence right after. And I was already listening, already watching, already doing the math she didn't even know existed. By the time the water dried on my skin, the story had already spread. I could hear it in the low murmurs drifting across the hill as I walked back toward the house, gravel crunching under my bare feet, each step carrying that same quiet weight I had learned to carry years ago when things did not make sense, but you knew reacting too fast would cost you later. The sun was higher now, burning off the thin layer of morning mist that used to sit over the lake like a blanket, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like that place was being watched instead of lived in. My phone buzzed before I even reached the porch. Willow Creek Estates community board. Someone had already posted it. A photo of me, standing on my own dock, water still dripping, caption like I was some kind of trespasser who got caught. Unauthorized use of HOA property. Fine issued. Further violations will be escalated. The comments were already stacking up, people I had never even spoken to weighing in like they had a vote in something they did not understand. Rules apply to everyone. About time someone enforced standards. That lake belongs to the community now. I could almost hear Victoria's voice behind every sentence, smooth, controlled, feeding them just enough to believe they were part of something official. I stepped inside, the screen door slamming shut behind me with a sharp crack that echoed through the kitchen, and the smell of old wood and black coffee grounded me again, something familiar in a space that had not changed even if everything outside it had. I dried my hands slowly, deliberately, then set the fine notice flat on the table, smoothing out the edges where the water had started to warp the paper. $1,000. Typed clean, no hesitation, like it was just another line item in a system designed to make people comply without asking questions. That was the part that almost impressed me. Not the number. The confidence. She had not asked. She had not checked. She had decided. And somewhere between that dock and this table, I realized this was not about the lake anymore. It was about control. I walked over to the cabinet my grandfather used to keep his paperwork in, the hinges creaking the same way they always had, and pulled out the old metal box that still smelled faintly like dust and oil. Inside were stacks of documents most people would have thrown away years ago: deeds, permits, survey maps, things that looked outdated until you needed them. I flipped through them slowly, the paper edges rough against my fingers, until I found the one I was looking for, the original land deed, dated back long before Willow Creek Estates was even a name on a brochure. I set it next to the fine and just looked at the two of them sitting there together, one trying to rewrite ownership with a printed line, the other proving it had never changed. Outside, I heard laughter, voices closer now, people walking down toward the water like it belonged to them, like a sign and a post made it real. I did not go back out. Not yet. Instead, I reached for my laptop, the quiet hum of it powering on filling the room as I pulled up the HOA bylaws, the same ones nobody reads until it is too late. If Victoria wanted to play this through paperwork, through rules, through numbers, then that was exactly where I was going to meet her. Because while she was busy making noise on the surface, I had already started looking underneath, and the deeper I looked, the more I could feel it, that same shift in the air, subtle but undeniable, like pressure building before something breaks. And this time, it was not going to be the water. By mid-afternoon, the lake did not look like mine anymore. Folding chairs lined the shoreline where there used to be nothing but tall grass and wildflowers. Coolers thumped against the dock with hollow plastic knocks, and the smell of sunscreen and cheap barbecue smoke drifted across the water like it had always belonged there. I stood behind the window, the glass warm under my fingertips, watching strangers step onto the same boards my grandfather had measured by hand, their shoes leaving faint wet prints where I had stood just hours earlier. Laughter echoed out over the water, loud, confident, the kind of sound people make when they believe they have permission. And that was the part that mattered. They believed it. Victoria had not just fined me. She had rewritten the story, turned something private into something shared with nothing more than a sign and a few well-placed words. My phone buzzed again. Another notification from the community board, this time a cheerful post about the first official lake day, complete with a schedule, refreshments, and a reminder that all residents must respect HOA regulations regarding usage. Must respect. I could almost hear the underline in her voice. I closed the notification without reading the comments this time. I did not need to. I already knew how that conversation was going. Instead, I zoomed in on the document open on my laptop, scrolling past pages of bylaws written in that dense, careful language designed to look harmless until you understood how it moved. Section after section, definitions, restrictions, enforcement clauses, each one building on the next like a system that fed itself. And then I saw it. Not a headline, not something bold, just a line buried deep enough that most people would never reach it. Assessment authority tied to property classification and resource management zones. I leaned closer, the faint hum of the laptop filling the quiet room as I read it again, slower this time, letting each word settle. Resource management zones. The lake. My lake. I pulled up the county records next, fingers moving faster now, pulling maps, overlays, zoning data, everything that connected land to law. The screen filled with lines and boundaries, clean digital edges outlining something that had never needed to be explained before. Parcel ownership, water rights designation, jurisdiction notes that most people would scroll past without understanding what they were looking at. But I did. Years of working with municipal systems had taught me one thing very clearly. Control was never where people thought it was. It was not in the signs. It was not in the noise. It was in the structure underneath, the part nobody questioned because it was too boring to notice. Outside, someone turned on a portable speaker, bass thumping softly through the air, blending with the sound of water lapping against the dock, and I could see Victoria now, standing near the edge of the lake, talking to a small group, her posture straight, her smile controlled, gesturing out over the water like she was presenting something she had built. She did not look toward the house. She did not need to. In her mind, this was already done. I sat back in the chair, the old wood creaking under my weight, and let the documents settle on the screen in front of me, every piece lining up exactly where it needed to be. She thought she had taken the surface, the view, the narrative, but what she had actually done was something much more useful. She had tied the lake into the system, and systems, if you understood them, could be rewritten. I glanced back out at the water one more time, at the people laughing, at the sign standing bright against the shoreline, and then back at the screen, where a different kind of number was starting to take shape, quiet, precise, waiting for the right moment to be seen. The next morning, the lake was louder. Not just the sound of water or wind, but voices layered over each other, early footsteps on gravel, car doors shutting, the low mechanical hum of someone inflating something bright and plastic that did not belong there. I stepped out onto the porch with a mug of coffee still too hot to drink, the steam curling up into the already warming air, and watched as more people arrived like this had been planned for weeks instead of hours. Someone had set up a folding table near the shoreline, neatly arranged stacks of paper, a clipboard, even a small cash box, and it took me less than a second to understand what I was looking at. They were charging access. I could hear Victoria's voice carrying across the yard, smooth and measured, explaining community usage guidelines, smiling that same practice smile as she handed out forms like she was hosting something official, something legitimate. "Sign here for lake access registration," she said, tapping the clipboard with a manicured finger, and people lined up without hesitation, pens scratching against paper, the quiet sound of compliance. I took a slow sip of coffee, the bitterness settling on my tongue, and felt something shift again, deeper this time, more precise. She had not just taken control of the narrative. She had monetized it. That was new. That was useful. I walked back inside without a word, the screen door closing behind me with that same sharp snap, and set the mug down next to my laptop, where the maps and documents were still open exactly where I had left them. Parcel boundaries, resource classifications, assessment clauses. I zoomed in again, refining the edges, layering in the HOA structure, the way their fee system tied back to shared assets, how they justified increases, how they distributed costs across members. It was all there, hidden in plain sight, a system designed to look rigid but built on assumptions nobody ever challenged. Until now. I opened a new document and started mapping it out, not emotionally, not reactively, but like I would any project, clean lines, clear inputs, predictable outputs. If the lake was now being classified as a managed resource under HOA control, then every cost associated with it had to be justified, maintained, and allocated. Maintenance, liability, usage. The words sat there on the screen, simple, almost harmless, but each one carried weight when applied correctly. Outside, laughter broke out again, louder this time, followed by the splash of someone jumping into the water, and I could picture it without looking, people treating it like it had always been theirs, like history could be replaced by a sign and a schedule. I did not stop typing. Instead, I pulled up the HOA financial disclosures, the ones buried deep enough that only board members usually bothered to read them, and started cross-referencing line by line. Current fee structure, reserve funds, special assessment conditions. It did not take long to see the gap. They were operating under a model that assumed stable, shared resources, predictable usage, minimal overhead. The lake did not fit that model. Not the way she was using it. Not the way she had just expanded its role overnight. I leaned back slightly, the chair creaking again, and let the numbers settle into place. Every line connecting to the next, every assumption becoming something I could adjust. Outside, I heard Victoria again, closer this time, her voice confident, explaining something about future improvements, maybe a dock expansion, maybe seating, maybe lighting, all the things that sounded good until someone had to pay for them. That was when I smiled, just slightly, because she had finally done it. She had turned the lake into a liability. And liabilities, in a system like hers, always had a cost. The only question left was who would be responsible for paying it. By the third day, the lake had a schedule. I could see it posted on that same white board near the shoreline. Neat black marker listing time slots like it was a public facility instead of something carved into my family's history. Morning swim hours, afternoon family access, evening quiet time, all of it structured, controlled, managed, and every time someone walked up to that table, they checked in like they were entering something official. The sound of pens clicking, names being written down, the low murmur of people asking questions and getting answers they did not think to challenge. It all blended into a rhythm that felt practiced even though it had only been a couple of days. I stood at the edge of my driveway this time, not hiding behind glass, just watching, arms crossed, the gravel pressing into the soles of my boots, the sun sitting high and hot over everything as if it was watching too. Victoria noticed me almost immediately. She always did. Her head turned just slightly, sunglasses catching the light, and for a moment she paused mid-sentence, just long enough to let me know she had seen me, before continuing like I was not even worth addressing. That was her move. Ignore, redirect, control the room. And it was working. People followed her lead without even realizing it. A man stepped up to the table and handed over cash, crisp bills sliding into that small box with a soft paper sound that should not have existed on my land, and I felt that same steady pressure building again. Not anger, not frustration, just clarity. I turned and walked back inside without saying a word, the screen door snapping shut behind me, cutting off the noise like flipping a switch. The house felt cooler, quieter, the hum of the air conditioner steady and constant, grounding me as I sat back down at the table where the documents were still spread out like pieces of something larger waiting to be assembled. I pulled up the HOA board structure next. Names, roles, voting rights, percentages tied to property classifications. And there it was again, that same subtle line most people would skip right over. Special assessment authority could be proposed and passed based on resource expansion and maintenance necessity, with weighted influence tied to impacted zones. Impacted zones. I zoomed in on the map again, overlaying the lake parcel with the surrounding lots, tracing the boundaries, watching how the designation spread outward like ripples, touching specific properties more than others, assigning responsibility in ways that were not immediately obvious unless you knew what to look for. And right at the center of that spread, right along the highest impact line, was Victoria's property. Corner lot. Premium view. Direct lake adjacency. The system did not care about titles or attitudes. It cared about proximity, usage, and classification. I leaned back slowly, the chair creaking under me, and let that settle in, the numbers aligning with the map aligning with the bylaws, everything clicking into place with a quiet precision that felt almost inevitable. Outside, I could hear her again, talking about future upgrades, mentioning things like safety improvements, shoreline stabilization, maybe even a small lighting system for evening access, each word sounding harmless on its own, but together they built something much heavier. Because every improvement required justification, and every justification required funding, and funding, in a system like hers, always came from somewhere specific. I opened a new file and started drafting, not a complaint, not a challenge, but a proposal, clean language, structured, professional, the kind of document that did not raise alarms because it followed the rules too well. Maintenance requirements for newly designated community water resources. Liability coverage adjustments. Usage-based fee recalibration. I could almost hear how it would sound when read out loud in a meeting. Calm, reasonable, impossible to dismiss without contradicting the very structure she had been using to control everything. I paused for a second, fingers resting on the keyboard, and glanced out the window again, watching as another group stepped onto the dock, laughing, unaware of the system they had just stepped into. Victoria stood there at the center of it all, confident, composed, completely certain she had already won. And that was the part that made this work, because the moment someone believes the game is over is the exact moment they stop looking at the rules. I looked back at the screen, at the numbers forming quietly in the corner of the document, and let a slow breath out, steady, controlled, because this was not about reacting anymore. This was about timing. And I was getting very close to the moment when everything she had built on the surface was going to be measured by what it actually cost underneath. That night, the lake finally went quiet again, but it was not the same kind of quiet I grew up with. This one felt temporary, like everything was just paused instead of at rest, the faint buzz of string lights still hanging over the shoreline, casting a soft glow across the water that should have been dark, untouched, natural. I stepped outside just after 10, the air cooler now, carrying that familiar mix of damp earth and still water, and for a moment I just stood there listening, letting the silence settle back into something I could work with. The dock creaked softly under my weight as I walked out, each step measured, deliberate, the same boards that had held me that morning now empty, stripped of voices, stripped of movement, but not stripped of what had been done to them. I crouched down and ran my hand along the edge where the wood met the water, feeling the cool surface ripple gently against my fingertips, steady, patient, unchanged by any sign or schedule or clipboard. Water does not recognize authority. That had always been true. I stood back up and looked across the lake, the reflection of those lights stretching out in thin, broken lines, and I could still picture where everything had been earlier, the table, the cash box, the people, the system she had built in less than 72 hours. It was efficient. I would give her that. But efficiency without structure does not last. I turned and walked back toward the house, the grass damp under my boots, and once inside, I did not hesitate. The laptop was already open, the documents still laid out like a blueprint waiting for execution, and I moved straight to the draft I had started earlier. I read through it once, slowly, making small adjustments, tightening the language, removing anything that felt like emotion and replacing it with clarity, because this was not a reaction. This was a calculation. Maintenance obligations for designated water resource zones. Liability adjustments based on increased public access. Usage-driven assessment recalibration tied to proximity and direct benefit. Each line built on the last, forming something that looked reasonable on the surface but carried weight underneath. I added one more section, carefully, deliberately, outlining projected costs, shoreline reinforcement, lighting maintenance, insurance coverage, routine inspections, all of it grounded in numbers that were not exaggerated, just complete. That was the key, not to inflate, but to include everything she had ignored. I attached the supporting documents next, the maps, the zoning overlays, the sections of the bylaws that justified every single point, making sure nothing stood alone, everything connected, everything supported. Outside, a breeze moved across the lake, just enough to shift the reflections, breaking them apart and pulling them back together again. And I could hear it faintly through the window, a soft, steady reminder that none of this had ever belonged to her in the first place. I leaned back in the chair and looked at the final document on the screen, clean, structured, complete, and for a moment I just let it sit there, the quiet hum of the room wrapping around it like a pause before something important. Then I clicked submit. HOA board proposal. Official channel. Timestamped, logged, distributed to every member with voting rights. No announcement. No warning. Just a document entering the system she trusted more than anything else. My phone lit up a few seconds later, confirmation received, and then another notification, and another, as the system began to do exactly what it was designed to do, circulate, notify, require acknowledgement. I set the phone down without checking the details, the soft vibration against the table fading into silence again, and walked back to the window, looking out over the lake one more time. It looked the same as it always had, calm, steady, waiting. The difference now was not on the surface. It was already moving underneath, through the same structure she had used to take control, carrying something she had not accounted for, something she could not ignore. And this time, I did not need to say a single word, because the system was going to speak for me. The first notification came before sunrise. A soft vibration against the nightstand, barely enough to wake most people, but I was already half awake. That same quiet awareness sitting just under the surface like it had been all week. I reached over, the room still dim, and glanced at the screen. HOA board notification. Emergency review scheduled. I did not open it right away. I already knew what it meant. Systems like that do not move unless something forces them to, and I had given it exactly what it needed. By the time the sun pushed its way over the trees, the lake was still empty. No chairs, no table, no voices. Just the low natural ripple of water returning to something that almost looked normal. Almost. I stepped outside with a fresh cup of coffee, the air cooler again, carrying that clean morning smell that had been buried under noise for days. And for a moment, I just stood there taking it in, the silence doing more work than anything I could have said. Then my phone buzzed again. And again. Messages this time. Not public posts. Private ones. Board members asking for clarification. Residents confused about new terminology they had never seen before. Words like liability redistribution, resource impact zones, assessment recalibration. The language had landed exactly where it needed to, just technical enough to sound official, just detailed enough to be taken seriously. I opened one message from a board member named Daniel Reeves, his tone careful, measured, asking if I could explain how the lake now qualified under expanded resource classification and whether that would affect existing fee structures. I read it once, then set the phone down without answering. Not yet. Outside, a car door slammed somewhere up the hill, followed by hurried footsteps on gravel, the kind of movement that carried urgency instead of leisure. I could feel it spreading now, that same shift in the air, subtle but undeniable, like pressure building inside something that had been sealed too tightly. I walked down toward the lake slowly, boots pressing into the damp ground, and as I got closer, I could see her already there. Victoria stood near the edge of the shoreline, phone in hand, pacing just slightly, her movements tighter than before, her posture still controlled but no longer effortless. The table was gone. The cash box was gone. The sign was still there, but it looked different now, less like authority and more like a statement waiting to be questioned. She glanced up when she saw me, just for a second, and this time she did not pretend I was not there. Her eyes held for a moment longer than they had before, searching, calculating, and I could almost see the moment it clicked that something had shifted beyond her control. "Did you file something with the board?" she asked, her voice still steady, but missing that smooth edge it had before. I did not answer right away. I just took a sip of coffee, the heat settling in my chest, and looked out over the lake instead of at her, letting the silence stretch just long enough to say what words did not need to. I followed the bylaws. I said finally, simple, direct, nothing extra. That was the truth, and it was enough. Her jaw tightened slightly, just enough to notice if you were paying attention, and she glanced back at her phone, scrolling, reading, rereading, the same way people do when they are looking for something that is not there anymore. Because what she had built was still standing on the surface, but underneath it, the system had already started to move, recalculating, redistributing, forcing everything into alignment with rules she thought she understood. A breeze moved across the water, light but steady, and I watched it carry small ripples toward the shore, one after another, each one subtle on its own but impossible to stop once they started. I finished my coffee and set the empty cup down on the dock, the wood still cool under my hand, and for the first time since all of this began, I could feel it clearly. Not tension, not pressure, just inevitability. Because once the system begins to correct itself, it does not ask permission. It simply moves forward, and anyone standing in the wrong place eventually feels the cost. The meeting notice hit everyone at exactly 9 o'clock, not as a suggestion but as a requirement, a formal line of text that carried more weight than any sign Victoria had planted by the lake. Mandatory HOA board session. Special assessment review. Attendance strongly advised. I could almost hear the shift ripple through the neighborhood, the same way sound travels across water, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. By 10, cars were already lining the street near the clubhouse, doors closing with sharper edges than usual, conversations quieter, more focused, the kind of tone people use when they realize something might affect them directly. I walked in last, the cool air inside carrying that faint smell of carpet cleaner and old paper, fluorescent lights humming softly overhead as rows of chairs filled faster than I had ever seen. Victoria stood near the front, speaking in low tones with two board members, her posture still composed but tighter now, her movements measured instead of effortless. She glanced up when I entered, just briefly, and this time there was no performance, no smile, just calculation. I took a seat near the back, setting my folder down on my lap, the weight of it steady, familiar, and waited. The room settled slowly, voices fading into a low murmur before the board president, Daniel Reeves, stepped forward, clearing his throat, adjusting his glasses, the small sound of paper shifting in his hands filling the silence. "We are here to review a newly submitted proposal regarding resource classification and associated cost adjustments," he said, careful, precise, every word chosen like it mattered, because now it did. He began reading, line by line, the same document I had sent, but hearing it out loud changed something, gave it presence, made it real in a way a screen never could. Maintenance obligations, liability exposure, usage expansion. Each phrase landed heavier than the last, and I could feel the room shifting with it. People leaning forward, expressions tightening as the structure unfolded piece by piece. Then came the numbers. Projected costs for shoreline stabilization. Insurance adjustments based on increased public access. Ongoing maintenance tied to resource management zones. No exaggeration. No padding. Just complete. A quiet spread through the room. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a collective realization settling in as Daniel paused, adjusted the page, and moved to the final section. Assessment redistribution based on proximity and direct benefit. That was where it changed. I saw heads turn slightly. People mentally mapping their own properties, calculating distances, trying to understand where they stood inside something they had never questioned before. Victoria stepped forward then, just slightly, her voice cutting in smooth, but firmer than before. This classification is incorrect, she said, controlled, confident, but missing that easy edge she used to carry. The lake has always been considered a shared amenity. Daniel did not look up right away. He simply tapped the document with his finger, the soft sound echoing faintly in the room. According to the submitted zoning overlays and original deed records, the classification has changed due to recent usage designation. He replied, calm, factual, not confrontational. The room went quieter. I could hear the faint buzz of the lights again, the soft shift of someone adjusting in their chair, the sound of paper being held just a little tighter. Victoria's jaw set, her posture straightening as she scanned the pages in her hand, flipping through them faster now, searching for something that was not there. Because everything she needed to stop this would have had to exist before she made the lake part of the system. And it did not. Daniel continued, moving into the assessment breakdown, his voice steady as he read the recalculated figures, each number tied directly to the map, the zones, the usage. When he reached her property, he paused just long enough to make sure it was clear. Primary impact zone, direct adjacency, highest usage exposure, he read, and then the number followed, clean, precise, unavoidable. It did not echo. It did not need to. It simply sat there in the room, heavier than anything that had been said all morning. I leaned back slightly, the chair firm against my shoulders, and looked past the front of the room toward the windows, where sunlight was just starting to reflect off the lake in the distance, calm, unchanged, exactly as it had always been. The difference was not out there anymore. It was right here, in the structure she had trusted, in the rules she had used, now doing exactly what they were designed to do. And for the first time since this started, nobody was looking at the sign by the water. They were all looking at the numbers in front of them. The room did not explode into noise the way people imagine moments like that should. It went quiet in a different way, heavier, like everyone was holding the same thought at the same time, but nobody wanted to be the first to say it out loud. Papers shifted. Someone cleared their throat. A chair creaked under a slight movement. And right at the front, Victoria stood completely still, the document in her hand no longer something she was controlling, but something she was trying to understand fast enough to stay ahead of. She flipped the page again, slower this time, her eyes scanning each line with a kind of focus that had nothing to do with confidence anymore. It was calculation now, but it was too late for that. Daniel adjusted his stance and continued, his voice steady, neutral, the kind of tone that carries authority without needing to raise itself. Based on current usage designation and supporting documentation, the proposed assessment adjustments are valid under Section 4.3.2, he said, tapping the page lightly. And then he looked up, scanning the room, not for approval, but for acknowledgement. Heads nodded. Not all at once, not dramatically, just small, reluctant confirmations as people began to understand what had already been set in motion. A man in the second row leaned toward his neighbor, whispering something under his breath, both of them glancing down at their copies, tracing lines, checking numbers, trying to find where they stood in all of this. And that was the shift. It was no longer about the lake as a place. It was about the lake as a system. Victoria stepped forward then, just one step, controlled, deliberate, her voice returning, but thinner now, stretched tighter than before. This is excessive, she said, holding up the document slightly, as if the act itself could change what was written on it. These numbers do not reflect reasonable use. Daniel did not argue. He simply nodded once, calm, almost patient. They reflect complete use, he replied, and that single word landed harder than anything else that had been said. Complete. Not inflated. Not exaggerated. Just complete. I watched her face for a second, the way her expression held, the way she kept it composed even as the structure she had relied on shifted under her feet, and I realized something simple in that moment. She had never expected to be measured by the same rules she enforced. The board moved to vote shortly after. No drama. No raised voices. Just a process, clean and procedural, each member stating their position one by one, the sound of their words blending into something final without ever becoming loud. Approved. 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 It was not unanimous, but it did not need to be. The system only required enough. When it was done, Daniel set the papers down, the soft thud echoing faintly across the room, and the meeting adjourned with the same quiet efficiency it had started with. People stood slowly, conversations beginning again, but different now, lower, more cautious, as they folded their copies and stepped out into the sunlight, carrying something heavier than they had walked in with. I stayed seated for a moment longer, letting the room empty around me, the hum of the lights fading back into the background, until there was nothing left to hear but silence again. Then I stood, picked up my folder, and walked out without looking back. The lake was waiting when I got there. No chairs, no table, no sign, just water, stretching out under the afternoon light, calm, steady, unchanged. I stepped onto the dock, the wood warm under my boots now, and set my hand against the railing for a second before pulling off my shoes and setting them down beside me. The air smelled like water again, clean, simple, the way it was supposed to. I stepped in slowly, the cool surface rising around me, and for the first time since all of this started, there was nothing trying to interrupt it. No voices, no paperwork, no control, just the quiet rhythm of something that had always been mine, moving exactly the way it was meant to. And somewhere, not here but close enough to matter, a system was doing the same thing, adjusting, recalculating, assigning cost where it belonged. I leaned back into the water, letting it carry me for a moment, and closed my eyes, not because it was over, but because it had already been decided. They thought control came from being the loudest voice in the room. But real control never needed to raise its voice. It just followed the rules all the way. To the end.